So on that note, let's talk evolution. I'm going to assume that you know a fair bit about evolution from just your life prior to coming to this college. And I think that's a fair assumption for a lot of us. However, if for whatever reason the idea of evolution or evolution via natural selection is not one which you are particularly well acquainted with, I would suggest to you reading chapter 3 in the book, which does a good breakdown of evolutionary theory and how it developed over time. Darwin's sort of initial formulations, how Mendel's ideas added to this, as well as kind of more recent findings and thoughts on how evolution occurs. However, so I'm going to assume, though, that you're either familiar with these concepts or that you've read chapter 3 to get caught up. I will say a few things about evolution. So, within it, anthropology uses evolution as our primary paradigm by which we understand how humanity arises. I'm saying primary paradigm because also within something like cultural anthropology, which is where my specialty is, I spend a lot more time thinking about the sacred origin stories of a culture than I do about evolution, because the physical evolution side of it is not terribly relevant to what I do, but the sacred origin stories are very relevant to understanding sacred land beliefs. But when you talk about sort of anthropology as a whole, sort of our dominant method for understanding human origins is very much the idea of evolution via natural selection over incredibly long time periods, right? Over millions of years. And we base it on the scientific method, the idea of a knowable world that follows certain laws that we can observe and thus make observations of, and develop better and better understandings over time. Now, what data collection looks like in physical anthropology, and especially paleoanthropology, aka physical anthropology of a long, long time ago, what data collection looks like for us is pretty complex, right? We can't, let's say, stick a bunch of Australopithecines in a laboratory and ask them to evolve in front of us. That wouldn't be ethical, and it would take millions of years, and it would be impossible. Instead, we have to work with the fossil record, and the fossil record is not as complete as we would like for a variety of reasons, including that the vast majority of beings that have lived on this planet never became fossils. It takes a very unique set of conditions to become a fossil. You have to have certain types of things occur, and so lots of living things never become fossils, and lots of the things that become fossils never get discovered if we don't know that they're there and never dig them up. And many of the times, even when we do dig them up, what we're dealing with is bits and parts of a hominid skeleton, rather than the entire thing. So we don't know as much as we'd like, but we do know some things, and we're trying to fit the puzzles together. And so if you hear in the book or in my own lecture some things like, at one point the book says, 12 species and another 30 species, talking about like different hominids. Part of what we're dealing with, the discrepancies here, is that there is legitimate debate between different scientists about how many different species, how many different genera, as we try to understand an incomplete fossil record and try to interpret it as best as we can. Now, as we look at the fossil record, we understand it through the lens of evolution by natural selection, the idea that there are inherited traits due to genetics. We now understand, although Darwin didn't understand how that worked, because genetics weren't well known at the time, but there are genetic traits that get passed on to the next population. When there is a shift in the frequency of certain types of genetic traits, that causes the species as a whole to start drift in a certain direction or another. As that happens over enough generation, you eventually get new species, or dramatically changed species. Sometimes one species might change into multiple, sometimes it may change into just one new species. Now, we oftentimes frame this as survival of the fittest. I think a much more accurate phrase would be reproduction of the most well-adapted. Because really the goal here is not so much survival. Survival from an evolutionary standpoint is really a means to an end. The point isn't so much for organisms to survive as it is for them to spread their genes. But for them to spread their genes, they need to survive at least for a while. And if you're something like an elephant or a human, you need to survive for a very long time, in part because you can have multiple children multiple times throughout your life, and also because it takes a lot of time to raise those children to the point where they are successful enough to go out and again spread their genes. And so evolution, the big driver here is things that can spread their genes well get rewarded. That doesn't necessarily mean, again, it's not always so much about long-term survival of the organism. Some organisms live a long time, some like a mosquito live very short times. Nor is it really about the fit. Well, I guess it depends what we mean by the fittest. It's not necessarily about being the strongest, or the coolest, or the fastest, or the most beautiful animal. There are all sorts of adaptations which are kind of wonky and kind of bonkers, but they're very good at passing on their genes, and so they've been selected for over time. Salmon, which are one of the important lifebloods of our Alaskan economy, are an excellent example. This is a picture that I took today hiking here in Soldotna, and you'll note that in the sign it says for every 400 king salmon fry in the Kenai River, only 100 make it back out to the ocean. Only 6 return to the river as adults, 2 survive long enough to spawn. So that's I don't know what that works out to, like a 0.25% mortality, or of them actually surviving long enough to pass on their genes. It is bonkers, and it is also bonkers when you consider that they spend years fattening up out in the ocean and then come back, and then by the time they're sort of well up the river, they've kind of just become almost half dead breeding vessels, right? Their body is being so much taken up by either sperm or egg respectively, and so much of their energy is sort of just funneled into getting them up the river to where they can spawn in their original habitat, lay down eggs or lay down sperm, and then literally die right after they breed. This is a fascinating adaptation. Salmon are not the strongest thing in the world. They're not the fastest thing in the world. But it's certainly a good way for that this species has found to pass on its genes, in the sense that it allows the salmon to get large enough and then be able to produce hundreds of potential offspring, and to do so in habitats that are theoretically safe, their original places where they were successfully raised. And so it makes sense in a lot of ways, even though from another perspective, it's kind of crazy. So again, evolution does not so much favor the strongest or the fastest as it does the most well-adapted. And well-adapted can come in a lot of different forms. And sometimes one species can evolve in a few different directions if there's a few different pathways it can go down, all of which would be good adaptations. And so this is what is presumed by physical anthropologists to have happened to whatever was the ancestor to both chimps and human beings and bonobos. They presumably all share a common ancestor because of their shared genes, according to the physical anthropology model, and at some point it became advantageous for some of them to evolve in the direction of human beings, or rather before that into Australopithecines, but in general in the human direction, but for others to evolve in a chimp direction, because both offered ways of survival and ways of passing on one's genes. So evolution favors that which is able to perpetuate genes. It also operates over extremely long time periods. So as far as we know, that should not read hominids, that should read hominid. Let me see if I can fix that right now. Hominins, aka all the apes that are human-like, are bipedal, Australopithecines, Homo parapithecus, all of these things that we're going to be talking about today, that's been occurring, as far as we can tell, for 5 million years, according to physical anthropology. So that's a very, very long time period by which for evolution to occur. Now, when we talk, so that's a little bit about evolution generally, but let's talk specifically about human evolution, because human evolution has some major, major things that make it, even though in some ways, we can look at human evolution as very similar to what other animals go through, in other ways, it is profoundly different. So the view from anthropology is anthropologists hold that evolution for humans is both biological and biocultural. And what I mean by biocultural is that once the ancestors of humans were advanced enough to develop culture, once their brains were advanced enough that they could pass on and communicate with each other certain shared ways of doing things, what we call culture, that drastically changed the game for evolution. Because from that point on, a whole lot of the changes that happened for humanity happened as a result of cultural changes, right? The Neolithic Revolution, 10,000 years ago, humanity develops the ability to domesticate animals and plants. Suddenly humans find a whole bunch of different types of habitats and niches they can move into, a whole bunch of types of food they can thrive on that didn't exist before. But unlike other animals, we didn't get these new food sources and habitats because our biology had really fundamentally changed, but because our culture had. So because humans change our culture over time, it's not just biological evolution, it's also biocultural evolution. Furthermore, our cultural developments then affect our biology. So in that regard, it's still evolution in the sense that humans have an environment that they have to adapt to, and that individual humans have to figure out how to best reproduce their genes, and we have to adapt to our environment. But the difference here from a lot of animal species is that our environments as human beings include our cultures. They include our choices, our opinions, our worldviews, our ideologies, all the things we do together as groups, the norms we have that then affect sort of who gets to spread their genes, right? The fact that we have wealth inequality in many places in 2020, sometimes very sharp wealth inequalities, can definitely affect who spreads their genes successfully or not, right? In terms of, let's say, as one example, better access to medical care in some countries over others, or in other cases, less access to contraceptive care, a whole lot of different factors. So our culture affects these kinds of, our sort of how we spread our genes as human beings in ways that are very different from a lot of other animal species. And I'll share with you a couple of examples, the first one of which is lactose tolerance. And I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago during the race lecture, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it today, but I want to reiterate that for most of humanity, the baseline is lactose intolerance, which is one of the reasons why we sometimes call it lactase persistence, because it's not so much that lactose intolerant people are weird and have something wrong. It's more that lactose tolerant people have something kind of strange, and the kind of strange thing is that they have a protein that lasts longer than people who do not have that protein, lactase, which allows you to break down milk and use it. So most human beings, by which I mean 2/3 of human beings, only have that when they're infants and small children, when they are nursing from their mothers. 1/3 of humanity, give or take, can still process milk as adults. Those who are lactose intolerant experience a wide variety of symptoms to varying degrees, including nausea and diarrhea and bloating, none of which is terribly pleasant, obviously, and make milk to be not a very good nutritional source for folks that are lactose intolerant. Now, when we look at the populations of people who have a lot of lactose tolerance, which include especially Europeans, as well as North Americans who are descended from Europeans primarily, as well as there's a few populations in Africa and the Middle East, but especially Europe, and nations where they have large percentages of European ancestral people. Lactose tolerance tends to be in cultures that traditionally developed herding early on, herding of livestock, herding of animals that could be used for dairy. And what they believe happened from archaeological evidence is that it didn't start out that everybody was drinking milk, right? They were all lactose intolerant, why would they? But they developed herding of these animals and then started using them for a variety of other things. So we know from contemporary herding, for example, that some cultures use herded animals for blood. They draw the blood from them and eat that like a soup or porridge. But also that they probably would have used milk instead to make things like cheese or yogurt that would be easier for a lactose intolerant person to break down. But that over time, people who had a lactose tolerant gene, so if you have, let's say, 10 different herding cultures, and one's here and one's here and one's here and 7 are here, in those cultures you've got Jane and Sarah, and Jane is lactose tolerant, and she's lactose tolerant just because it's a mutation, right? Like any other trait of humanity, it started as a mutation. Evolution works because when your DNA is getting passed down basically from generations, there's errors in the DNA copying, and so you get kind of accidental chance changes in the DNA code. And so for whatever reason, again, this Jane and Sarah example in the same culture, they're herders. Jane has this crazy mutation where she can drink milk as an adult, and actually so does all of Jane's family. And as a result, they figure out like, hey, I can actually drink this milk stuff, and they suddenly have a food resource that other families in their village don't. And that might not seem like that big of a deal. Oh, cool, you can drink milk. But if you're a society where it's hard for us to imagine now with how relatively prosperous perhaps a lot of the industrialized world is, but try to imagine from the point of view of somebody living tens of thousands of years ago, or well, it'd actually just be several thousand years ago, and where the difference between life and death might be a lot more slim, where people the degree to which they can or can't process food might determine whether or not they're reproductively healthy and able to nurture their babies and able to have their babies and able to have typical menstruation. if you think of it from that perspective, the ability to incorporate in this new major food source would have made a big difference potentially. And so the idea is over time this was selected for, and so more and more people in those societies that had lactose tolerance would have had more kids, spread their genes, and eventually what you have is societies where not everybody is lactose tolerant, but a large percentage, as is the case in much of Europe, as is the case in much of North American people who are of European descent. The percentage is much shorter if we consider, for example, Asian Americans and as well as Native Americans, where the percentage is below 10% who are lactose tolerant within North America. The percentage for Hispanic population is higher, but still lower than those of sort of northern/westernish, well, sort of northern/easternish European descent at 50%. And so you have, even within groups of people that have European ancestors, different rates. And again, that would have some degree to do with which groups of people were doing the most herding historically. So, culture affects biology. Example number 2. Old Order Amish. So the Old Order Amish, if you're not already familiar, are a Christian group who sees itself very much as adhering to Jesus Christ's teachings within the Bible about simple, good, kind living. They are also, in a sense, have often been an isolationist group in the sense that they have received some degree of persecution from outsiders and also to some degree wanted to maintain their own way of life. To some degree as self-enclosed communities. That's not entirely true. Certainly Amish people have plenty of interactions with the outside world, to whom they sell furniture, interact with on livestock deals, all sorts of things. But you find Amish communities strongly stress the idea of community and an enclosed community that works together and is strong together. And so in that regard, Old Order Amish communities tend to be very tight-knit. They also tend to be fairly endogamous, meaning that Old Order Amish people marry and have children with other Old Order Amish people. So Amish people marrying Amish people to have Amish children who then marry other Amish children. And they were started in the United States. The Amish were actually a relatively small number of people who had come from Europe seeking more religious freedom. That matters in terms of their genetics because, well, let me tell you the punchline and then we can talk about the setup. Basically, a study was done in the 60s that found that Amish blood types differed significantly from other Euro-Americans. So, specifically, for example, among O blood type, the Amish people that were surveyed at the time, 15% had O blood, which was compared to 45% of the, quote, Anglo-Saxon. This is the 60s when this paper was written. 45% of the Anglo-Saxon population in the United States. Their A blood type, by contrast, was 65%, which is way higher than the rest of the Anglo-Saxon population at 41%. So their blood types were significantly, and then they had about double the rate of AB blood type. So their blood types were really, really different from other people from the same part of the world. How can that be? Well, one of the reasons is because of what we call founder effect. And so founder effect basically means that groups that, basically when you have a small group of people who start out together and all have children with each other, what's going to happen is that you're going to be heavily affected by whatever traits that small group of people had. So if you've got like a bunch of O type, a bunch of A type, a bunch of B type, but then this is the first Amish community, and it's got a bunch of folks with A blood type, the kids are going to tend to have A blood type, and that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with sort of survival of the fittest so much as it has to do with just random chance, right? You happen to have gotten the five people in your town who became Amish and then moved to North America happen to have had A blood type, right? You see where I'm going with this. And so in this case, culture affects biology because religion is affecting biology and politics. As a persecuted religious group that wants to form its own self-inclusive communities goes off and forms its own self-inclusive communities, they sort of by chance are including a lot of people with a certain blood type. And so over time, what that means is that their blood type as a population is very different, statistically speaking, than the surrounding populations. So culture affects biology.